Hello, class. Welcome back. This is week 2. We're going to be talking about the Yanomami tribe and the Inuit tribe, um, and their modes of subsistence, as well as the effects of globalization on these Native American tribes. All right, let's begin. So, the Yanomami tribe. Here we have a background of the jungle. The Yanomami live in the jungles of Brazil and Venezuela. They're comprised of 35,000 people, roughly. But what's interesting is that they're also made up of different villages. And these villages are all unique in the sense that they all have their different dialects and different characteristics, as many different cultures have. So it's interesting to see kind of like a microcosm of culture within a culture, so to speak. But yeah, so we can describe the Yanomami as foraging horticulturists. They basically eat anything that's in the jungle. This can range from snakes, wild pigs, monkeys, deer, jaguars, insects, larvae, fish, crab, also wild honey, plantains, sweet potatoes, and palm fruit. Like I said, the Yanomami live in the jungles of Brazil and Venezuela, but what that really means is that they live in isolation. So when they're literally living off the land and have learned to even pioneer shifting cultivation of the soil, so that this way they can sustain themselves for generations to come. They have pretty much mastered cultivating plantains and bananas. They also trade amongst themselves. They have a well-developed system of trade amongst themselves in the villages. Now, this is mostly due to distribution, in the sense of need and distribution. Those in need will basically ask for those that have for food. But also sometimes these trades can be symbols of alliances, which is very interesting. Now they also have a divided labor, which I thought was very neat. They divide the labor amongst men and women, of course, as hunter-gatherers did in the past. For example, the men are known for their weapon making, their hunting, and gardening, while the women are known for threading plaited baskets, as well as spinning cotton. Also, what is neat is that is literally the only difference. They share everything else equally, all activities, from weeding to harvesting to food processing to collecting fuel and water. But what's interesting is that even though they do almost everything together as men and women equally, they do participate in phases. So the men will collect the heavy poles and lash them all together when constructing a house, but like the women will be the ones that collect endless amounts of bundles of palms, but then the men will take all those bundles of palm and then intermesh them to make a roof for a house. So there's a really big division of labor, but it's also equal and playing to each gender's, I guess, assets. And then also what's interesting is that they have land tenure, and what that means is when they clear the forest of land, for example, and this could be any land near a village. Now that land belongs to the person who has now cleared the forest and started a garden. He is now considered the proprietor of the land and also the cultivator of the land. So that land is now his and his only, and his duty to protect from invaders. All right, so their sustenance, like I said, the Yanomami eat anything that the jungle has to offer, and that's a wide variety of foods. Um, Again, the snakes, pigs, monkeys, deers, jaguars, um, and interestingly, crops. They're most notably, I'm sorry, notable crop that they produce is tobacco, peach palms, plantains, and bananas. A fun fact is that 75% of the Yanomami daily caloric intake comes from bananas and plantains. And here we have a picture of a really cool Brazilian monkey. Unfortunately, they do eat monkeys, which it can be considered taboo to other cultures, but to them it is just food and part of their daily cycle. Here we have a picture of the Yanomami tribe from the air, an aerial view. You can see they are completely surrounded by forest, well, jungle forest. And the rainforest is very unforgiving, but they have found a way to live off bananas, plantains, and everything else that it has to offer. Interestingly, 15% of the entire population are tasked with light commuting of trade and wage labor. So what that means is that 15% of the Yanomami tribe is basically commuting through the jungle and staying in provisional camps along the way and trading anywhere from baskets, bows and arrows to different exotic foods within the jungle. The effects of globalization on the Yanomami are seen in the pollution in the waterway, diseases that they are acquiring, and they basically do not have traditional medicine to fight it off. Other negative effects of globalization are that the warriors are no longer using their traditional bows and arrows and have to resort to using trading for guns because of invaders. But one of the good things about globalization is that there's advocation. Davy Kopinawa was able to speak at the British House of Commons and to the UN and present the struggles that his people are going through. What is interesting also about the Yanomami is that they are pioneers in the sense that they can live off of this isolation. They've come a long way. Most of the technologies that they have acquired, if any, are gifts from missionaries, such as axe, fishing hooks, anything that can help them sustain themselves more easily in the harshness of the jungle. Okay. Now the Inuits are definitely hunters and gatherers. What's interesting about the hunters and gatherers, or the Inuits here, is that they are considered to be in a mixed economy or an economic flow. Now what that means is that the foods such as seal, caribou, and deer are traded for money. And money is essential is that it's used to acquire more food. So the Inuits are people that are transitioning. But people are transitioning all over the world from wild to supermarkets. But in the Arctic, they continue to need both, even as policy is not as dealing with those food categories equally. Rapid changes in their food systems due to globalization and global warming, the Arctic is experiencing the effects of climate change fastest and can lead to malnutrition and the loss of indigenous knowledge. So M.T. Harder and G.W. Wenzel are two anthropologists that have done extensive research on the sustenance and the subsistence modes of the Inuits. And they basically describe, the Nunavut community in Qikiqtaluk region of Canada. And what they describe is that their food security is based on the movement of resources. And this resources being seal meat and or dollars, and they're almost interchangeable over there, because the Inuits have really maintained their hunter-gatherer state and only really use money to acquire more food, and that's basically it. So for them, money equals food, and food equals money. Here we have an Inuit family, and we also see a picture of them hunting a seal. Now, I love seals. I recently just found out about seal clubbing, and that was something horrible that I just didn't need to know. But now that I do know that for at least the Inuits, it's a part of their culture, it's a part of their food and their way of life and their traditions. Also, the blubber in the narwhal, the whales, and the seals also sustain the Inuit. So they use almost every single part of the animals. And they will trade these animals, again, to acquire more food, but also to acquire equipment to harvest. Now, this is also an effect of globalization. Yes, they use snowmobiles, and they use, instead of husky dogs, to travel. But this is also just because of globalization. They are just using it as a means to sustain their lives. The Inuit acquire traditional resources such as caribou, and they're tied to the production of the food. So all of their money is tied into the production of food or towards food. And because food is so important to them, it's what kept them alive during all those harsh times in the icy winters. For them, it's very cold, and they've survived many periods of starvation thanks to their hunting skills. So the data makes it clear that the disparities in material resources between households in the Inuit, which is, I guess, a descriptive word for a person, an Inuit person, is a greater burden for the traditional resources provisioning. So basically, what that's saying is that there's a greater disparity in the material resources between an Inuit person, and they're putting that burden of acquiring or provisioning these foods on the people that are better off, individually or household. So they're kind of dependent on those that are doing better within the community to sustain themselves if they're a little bit worse off than someone who has more money. Wenzel also said that money is perceived as a means to accomplish and facilitate the harvest, and not as an end in itself. And I think that's very important because it plays to the difference in the way they view money from a capitalist nation, from an agricultural nation, to a hunter-gatherer group. The Inuits basically will remain hunters more than half a century after the centralized settlements, the snowmobiles, and money became significant. And I think that plays to a very important part of society and what they're trying to maintain. Solons in 1999 said, "It is clear that the research on Inuit subsistence, not only on hows and whats, but also on its social-cultural dimensions, is the conceptual theoretical link to a wider field of hunter-gatherer studies." And I think it's very important that we need to continue these studies, because in the end, they will help us not only to connect the dots between our cultures, but see how we're all the same. You know, globalization is affecting everyone. Climate change is affecting everyone. You know, the Yanomami are in isolation, but yet they feel they're still being affected by pollution in the waterways. You know, the Inuits are also living in isolation in Canada, in remote places of Canada, but yet they also have to deal with pollution, and worse off with a decrease in wildlife. And a decrease in wildlife is a decrease in food, and a decrease in food leads to destruction.